F-14 Tomcat, piloted by Lieutenant Devon Jones, was shot down on January 21st over the barren desert of Iraq.
Once you've got a guy on the ground that you know he's there and you know he's alive, it's time to change the plans and do whatever it takes to make sure you can get at him.
Captain Trask and his crew flew many hours in broad daylight in their search for the stranded Navy pilot.
And the hard part was he was now so far north that we were going to have to cross the major highways that run east-west from Baghdad over toward Jordan. And these were our biggest threats in the whole theater, was to cross those roads because they were heavily traveled with military vehicles in the middle of the daytime. We were painted brown camouflage and just hoped we were far enough away they really wouldn't realize that we were bad guys.
An Iraqi truck came in from our 11 o'clock position, and I called him out about the same time the A-10 pilot called him out on the radio, and Major Holman, the co-pilot, told him to smoke the truck.
We immediately made a break away from the truck, and the A-10s immediately rolled in on it. And all we did was make one big loop and turn back toward it. By the time we got turned back to the truck, it was just a big smoking hole. A 30-millimeter cannon on an A-10 is going to take out a truck every time. But the truck actually rolled up to within 50 or 100 yards of where Lieutenant Jones had dug his hole in the desert, and it was coming straight at him. We made a real quick stop landing, rolled up right next to him. Pararescuemen jumped out of the back, ran him, grabbed him by the flight suit, pulled him on board. We were on the ground about 20 seconds, and we pulled pitch and turned back south to get out of there.
It was a great feeling. I mean, we still had to get out of Iraq, and that was just secondary, knowing that we had picked him up and he was safe inside and we were going to get him out of there. He came up to the cockpit and stuck his head in there, a big grin on his face, and patted everybody on the shoulder. That was a pretty good feeling. I was glad to be a part of it. We all were proud. I mean, we got one of our guys back.
SOF Stories Live features guests who are often decades removed from an operation, so the stories are told as they remember them and are not cleared for release by the Department of Defense. All content discussed is unclassified and/or publicly released by the DoD prior to this broadcast. Our intent is to share these moments in history as experienced by the special operators who were there.
Good afternoon. I'm Chief Master Sergeant Randy Anderson, U.S. Air Force retired and former Air Commando, and the host for today's Operation Desert Storm, the rescue of Slate 46. Thank you for joining us. Each month over the next several months, SOF Stories Live will invite former special operators represented from every service branch of U.S. SOCOM and explore past campaigns and operations, focusing solely on the historical context of special operations involvement from a personalized perspective. All guests are former special operators who served at the operationally deployed level. We will selectively choose officers and enlisted members for a particular topic based on their actual personal involvement in various operations, not from the campaign point of view, but as special operators at the tactical level. This venue will give them a unique opportunity to share with you, the audience, their insights and unbiased experiences from their personal point of view. Some of it widely documented in publications and film, and some of it not. This month marks the 30th anniversary of the events surrounding the U.S. buildup in the Persian Gulf, Operation Desert Shield, and the liberation of Kuwait, codename Operation Desert Storm. Today, SOF Stories Live is honored to welcome 3 Air Force special operators who executed this extremely high-risk mission and the successful rescue and recovery of the U.S. Navy F-14 Tomcat crew, callsign Slate 46. These special operators were in the dangerous forefront of this pivotal moment in special operations history and helped force successful U.S. and international policy to oust occupying Iraqi forces in the liberation of Kuwait. Today, I'm honored to welcome U.S. Air Force retired Air Commandos, my former squadron commander, Lieutenant General Tom Trask, Master Sergeant Craig Dott, and Master Sergeant Greg Van Hyning. Hello, gentlemen. Welcome to SOF Stories Live, and thank you for sharing your stories with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to give the audience a little back history on the rescue of Slate 46. Slate 46 is one of the most famous missions we flew during the Operation Desert Storm. It was a combat search and rescue sortie performed by A-10 Sandys and MH-53Js from the 20th Special Operations Squadron. This event occurred on January 21st, 1991 to recover Lieutenant Devon Jones, an F-14B pilot, from the VF-103 Sluggers, call sign Slate 46. That was downed in Iraq with its Rio Radar Intercept Officer, Lieutenant Lawrence Slade. The crew launched on their first combat mission to escort an EA-6B, supporting an early morning strike package hitting the Al-Assad airfield just west of Baghdad. During the egress from a target, Jones and Slade were shot down by an SA-2 Soviet-made missile, surface-to-air missile. That occurred at 0320 Zulu on the morning of the fourth day of the war, while returning the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. After ejecting and during the descent, the two men saw each other for the last time before entering the clouds. And this is where the story begins. Gentlemen, let's start first with General Trask. General Trask, what was your rank, position, and assignment when you first learned you were going to deploy to Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm?
Chief, good afternoon. Good to talk with you. It's great to see you. Yeah, I was a captain in 20th SOS at the time, an MH-53 pilot. I was a plans officer in the squadron, and I got deployed over there, not with the very first wave, but about 3 or 4 weeks later. So it was around early September.
Okay, what about you, Craig?
Hey, Chief, thanks for having us on. It's good to be here. Yeah, I was assigned to the 20th SOS, had been there about 2 years. I was a sergeant E4, I guess we used to call that a buck sergeant back in the day, aerial gunner. And, you know, beyond that, worked as a supply NCO in the 20th.
Okay, and Greg Van Hyning, same thing. What was your rank, position, assignment when you first were deployed there? How'd you wind up on this crew?
Well, I don't know exactly how. Let me first say thanks, Chief, for the invitation. Thank you, Chelsea, and it's nice to be able to take a moment and share this story with y'all. At the time, I was instructor flight engineer, also evaluator flight engineer, and I was working in the Stan Eval office at that time. The assignments there are over, you know, they, as an instructor and evaluator, I'm constantly trying to put out the best product. And I think not only from our crew, but from any crew that goes out to do a mission, those guys are ready to do it because we took our position seriously. And no, it's just an honor to be here today. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. It's an honor to have you guys. General Trask, could you please give a brief explanation why the MH-53s, a SOF force from the newly established Air Force Special Operations Command, they had basically migrated over from 23rd Air Force. We had a sister CSAR element at that time, but now the Air Force Special Operations Command, the MH-53s were assigned to them under US SOCOM. What you were assigned to CSAR mission as opposed to CSAR forces. What was the command relationship, and why did the MH-53 Pavlo, a SOF aircraft, wind up doing this mission?
Yeah, it's an interesting story, Randy. They, you know, through the 80s, the Air Force had always had its combat rescue forces in the mobility command, which was not the command that would have used those forces in combat. At the time, Strategic Air Command and Tactical Air Command had bombers and fighters that would use them. And there was a big argument in the Air Force of who should pay for CSAR forces. And what happened was nobody paid for them. And like probably a lot of the guys in the 20th had done time in rescue units like I had before I came to Special Operations. And those units closed down. My unit was at Edwards Air Force Base. It actually closed in 1987. So by the time the Gulf War happened, there were very little CSAR units left in the Air Force, and we hadn't started to build up the MH-60 CSAR capability that would happen a few years afterwards. So when we got tasked to deploy under SOCCENT, under the Special Operations component, the Joint Force looked around for a force capable to do CSAR and realized there was no Air Force CSAR coming. And so that mission got handed off to the Special Operations component, and not just for the MH-53s, but also the AFSOC H-60s and the 3rd to the 160th Army Special Operations Aviation was also part of that CSAR element. And that was one of our major missions going into the fight.
Okay, and I think that's interesting to bring that up because you know, they had expressed their capabilities document just prior to that and basically killed CSAR as we knew it, as a conventional Air Force, and basically just said we're personal recovery. There is significant difference in a combat search and rescue because there's certain sequence of events that have to occur. So I find that very interesting. Could you please help the audience understand what the location, the AOR situation, what you were doing the morning you were notified a U.S. Navy crew was shot down and you were tasked for a rescue mission? Had you rehearsed or, you know, had you trained in CSAR rescue tactics in the desert prior to that? I'll start with you, Tom.
Yeah, so we were on alert that morning for CSAR for that purpose, out in a base very northwestern part of Saudi Arabia called RR. Later on, the JSOC folks would arrive there and would operate out of that base, but that was our base. And what we had done is divide Iraq into 4 areas for CSAR. The very western or southwestern part of the country was the part we were responsible for. There were 2 other bases in Saudi covering a central and eastern part, which included Kuwait, and then the Sakir guys up in Turkey were covering the northern part for CSAR. So we had planned for it. It was not the mission we went and deployed to do, but during the Desert Shield portion over the previous 2 or 3 months, we'd spent most of our time training and preparing for that mission. So we were actually on alert that morning. Our crew, if you guys remember, was actually number 6 in line that morning, because in the first few days of the war, the 20th, our squadron was the one getting all the missions. We had led the Apaches on the first night. There had been a rescue attempt a couple nights earlier where they didn't get the guy. He was captured. So the 20th was the only squadron that had gotten some time across the border. So the Colonel Garlington was the site commander that night. He put our 2 Pavlos at the back of the line behind 2 MH-60s from the 55th. And then 2 Navy H-60s, which were also there doing CSAR. So we were kind of at the back of the priority line thinking we'd probably just get a good night's sleep that night.
Yeah. Greg, this is for Van Hyning. What was your take on that?
Well, you know, we go up there and you had just a big open area with a bunch of cots set up, and you know, you never knew what the weather was going to be. You know, I woke up one morning and, well, actually one early, and my feet were froze because I hadn't taken my boots off. I went to warm up. I stepped outside and it was snowing, you know, so you never knew what you were going to have for weather up there, how cold it would be, how many people there would be there. Be assured pretty much that the area where we were bunked at would be full of operators in there, you know, both Army and Air Force. And, you know, that's all you did was rest and, you know, try to have yourself ready to jump up and go when you got the call.
Oh, okay. Craig, what about your insights in that? You know, how did you prepare yourself, you know, during that time, understanding what was? Were you a little disappointed? What were your emotions during that time, Craig?
Yeah, I'd say, first of all, I was pretty gung-ho and ready to get out there and just get into the fight. So I wasn't disappointed at all to be sitting a CSAR alert. We kind of knew we were going to get that mission initially, and we spent a significant amount of time actually training up. You know, our pararescue men were attached to us, made part of the hard crew. We got a chance to kind of gel and come together, work on, you know, tactics, crew coordination, things like that. Several weeks prior to the war kicking off and assuming those alert missions, you know, we integrated with A-10s previously, did some daytime ops, got to see them in their traditional Sandy role as a rescort, see the daisy chain. We worked on, you know, a lot of those, you know, tactics that affect a successful pickup of a survivor. So authentication methods, you know, spinning chem lights on 550 cord, you know, different signaling devices and things like that. Worked with our Siri instructors to kind of refine some of those techniques. So we were pretty well prepared, well geared up, and you know, I was just looking forward to getting out there and making something happen. So I was pleasantly surprised that morning when they woke us up, told us that there was a shoot down. We're probably going to get to react to that. And I had asked one of the H-60 pilots across the table what the weather was like. Had anyone checked weather? And he said, yeah, it's 0-0. And I just smiled at him and said, hey, pave country, you know, we have the tools to make that work. So I was pretty excited to get going.
Right. You know, and that dovetails into the conversation. You know, this was a daylight rescue, something that it's not in our wheelhouse. We don't like daylight rescues because we learned from Southeast Asia, we're extremely vulnerable in daytime rescues, particularly in a hostile environment. Unlike the other environments, we were in a different thing. We were opposing a major military force for the first time in Southeast Asia. Panama, you really couldn't count. This was a sophisticated air defense system. So now we're doing this daytime as opposed to a nighttime. What type of preparation did you do to solve for this? For example, how did you do the C2? What was the rescue package configuration, the crews? You know, how did you prepare? How did you work that? Greg, I'll start with you.
Well, you know, it's a matter of it starts at the ground level right there with your pre-flight. You go out there and you make sure that that aircraft is configured with every piece of equipment that you could possibly, you know, require for any mission that you're called on. And then it's just a matter of, you know, bringing up your training. And that was the whole focus, you know, within the unit, was you train exactly the way you're going to go fight. And there was never an issue with this or that. We were easily brought back on the track by any obstacles we might have run into. You know, it's all about completing the mission and coming up with a viable answer to any roadblocks that you hit and moving on with it. And that's essentially the big thing there. It boils down a lot to added, and that's mission accomplishment.
No, okay. Well, I appreciate it. Tom, I'd like to go to you on this. Why did we use 50 cals? Why not miniguns? Why did we not do personal? What was the issue? Why the configuration we had? How did we go about authenticating survivors? You know, some of you had prior rescue experience, but in the most part, you know, rescue, the traditional classic as we knew it, we didn't really practice that. But there was a lot of carryover experience. Would you like to discuss that with me, Tom?
You bet. Yeah, I can talk about that. We talked a lot about configuration and took a lot of advice from the guys that had a lot of experience. And we had, you know, we still had Vietnam guys that were in the leadership positions there and some of the senior positions. We talked a lot about how the business was done in Vietnam. You know, in Vietnam, they didn't use 50 cals on their 53s because the environment was completely different. A minigun was much more appropriate in Vietnam, where you're going to have short range, you're in a tree line, you've got that to deal with. But we knew we were going to be operating, particularly in daytime, where you could see for 30 miles and everybody could see you for 30 miles, and you needed a defensive weapon that could reach out, you know, with the range of a 50 cal, you know, to allow you to kind of break away from any kind of threat situation. Typically our weapons with 350 cals mounted on the 53 are mostly designed to help you break contact in a situation so you can get away. So the 50 cal was the obvious choice. We didn't normally fly 350s back at home, but that was what made sense in the desert there. And it was really the first time going into the Gulf War that we thought about it from that perspective. A lot of the other things that we had were just carryovers from Vietnam, like authentication procedures. It was the stuff that the guys had been taught in SEER school for years. Now, there was some new things that were happening. If you get into the details, the PRC-112 was the brand new survival radio that you could actually home on, but there were very few of them in theater. In our mission, it turned out that the front seater had the 112, or had the old radio, the PRC-90. The back seater had the 112, which didn't work, which was a brand new radio. And we were just getting used to it. So we thought we'd be able to home in on his PRC-112 but that radio never came up. And we went back to old Vietnam style, homing in on the PRC 90 that the front seater carried that allowed us to pick him up. So from that perspective, it was really a lot of the experience and lessons learned from Vietnam.
Well, and I can totally appreciate that, General Trask. Craig, let's talk about the navigation. Obviously, you can't do the classic non-combat search and rescue. You can't go out and do creeping lines, high alert bird, attracting a lot of attention because they could see you from 20 miles away. It's pretty flat where you guys were operating. How did you overcome that? Did you fly at a certain altitude? Tell me what your tactics were for Craig.
Okay, yeah, for Craig. So, back then I was the tail gunner, so I was kind of, just trying to take a lot of that in as the mission unfolded. Now, keep in mind, just as the general said, we had a lot of Vietnam era TTPs to employ in that situation. But as it turned out, zero visibility on the ramp at the time we were going to spin the aircraft up and launch presented a different challenge. If the guys remember, we had a compressor stall on run up. And when that engine popped, Greg was running that engine up and it popped, you heard a loud bang. And he assumed one of us cut loose 50 cal round in the back on the ramp as we were arming up, just kind of getting things ready to go during the spin up. So, stranger things would unfold, but, we got the aircraft run up, and initially to take off in zero visibility and immediately transition into a terrain following profile. I felt pretty comfortable with that initially because I'm like, well, yeah, I can't see anybody, but they can't see us. So I felt pretty good about being cloaked in that weather until we broke out pretty much right at the border. So then things got interesting. We kind of dropped down to a lower altitude. Typically day tack just to get some visibility and things. We might be around 100 feet or 80 feet, but we weren't far north of the border when the radio chatter spooled up and we were told that a MiG was inbound, had us locked up, and we're probably going to get shot at. So at that point, it got pretty exciting. A quick discussion that I recall up front between Tom and Mike were, if we snap south towards the border, how close to the border are we going to get before he catches up to us? Whatever he was doing, 500 knots or something. It's like, well, not very far. So the decision was just made to get lower at that point and keep trucking. So we were down around, 15, 20 feet for the rest of the day. We got pretty comfortable at being that low. And that's just one of the things that happens in real time when you just got to make an adjustment and make it work. But funny you should say that we should not have been out there doing traditional, SAR patterns like a creeping line or expanding square. But as I recall, initially we didn't have a good fix on the Survivor. Overhead capabilities, air breathers, we could hear AWACS, maybe some other fighters were further up in the cap. Trying to make contact, but we were given vectors a couple of times to hit a different coordinate and literally search that area. So we did start kind of sweeping across the desert and poking around and every now and then we'd see something interesting. I think we saw an ejection seat or something out there. We made a landing, poked around at it. So things just kind of evolved. We had to roll with it. Every 10, 15 minutes, it was a different thing happening that we made decisions and we adjusted our tactics accordingly.
Hey, Randy, if I can jump in and just add to that, because you talk about the daytime element. This was the first day that we'd even sat alert in daytime. For the first days of the war, we weren't even allowed to sit alert, and there was no consideration of going in daytime because of the IADs were heavy enough that everything had been planned to go only at night. We had briefed all of the tactical crews that if they got shot down, they would have to make it till darkness, and then the special operations crews would come and get them. And so this was the first time when the IADs had been degraded just enough that they would at least consider sending us in daytime. And so it was the first mission flown in daytime by any of us going in as part of the Gulf War.
Well, and thank you for that, General Trask. I appreciate that. Now, your crew configuration, obviously, you got 2 pilots, 2 engineers, and 2 gunners on, for the audience on an MH-53 payload. But you also have a rescue element on there. In more modern times, we use SF, Special Forces, Green Beret, ODA types, or we use SEALs. But in this case, we went with the traditional more CSAR platform rescue package. Explain who was the rescue element on the aircraft with you, the people that would actually disembark the aircraft and go. And I'll start with you, Tom.
Yeah, so, you know, as those Air Force CSAR units had shut down, the pararescue community had not condensed. So there were lots of PJs out there that didn't have helicopter units to be attached to anymore. So we actually had a fair number of PJs that were deployed there. So the tactic we came up with, which was to add 2 PJs as the standard configuration. So we had 2 added to our aircraft. Our wingman, Mike Kingsley's aircraft, had 2. So the 2 guys, Tom Bedard and Ben Pennington, were the 2 guys. I believe they, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they had come out of Kadena. They were not part of our squadron. They were just part of the PJ task force that was formed to help us do the CSAR piece. And they weren't integrated into the air crew like they had been in the rescue days, you know, prior to the Gulf War. So they were largely passengers on the airplane during the tactical employment of our mission, and then we're there to do the actions on the objective, to pull the guy in, and then to treat him with the medical pieces if that was needed on the way back.
You know, in the broadcast, I appreciate that, General Trask. You know, Greg, who was the PJ in that opening film clip? I think Chelsea has a picture of that also. That you could, you know, who is rescuing the pilot? Who was that pararescueman?
Yeah, we had 2 pararescuemen on board, Tom Bedard and Ben Pennington. And Ben Pennington was the PJ who headed out the ramp to meet the pilot and bring him back on.
Oh, okay.
And both PJs were great guys and absolutely dedicated, as all those younger PJs are. And it's always nice to have them along, because you never know what's going to happen. And you're talking about world-class paramedic skills right there at hand, you know, to help you out if you've got somebody that gets wounded on board the aircraft, a crew member or anybody else.
Awesome. Now, guys, now that we did this, and Craig, I'm going to address it to you first. What impressed you or inspired you during the mission? What made you laugh, and how did the crew communicate their concerns during the rescue? Because it wasn't, I want to illustrate this for the audience. It wasn't a quick jump across the border, make the rescue, and then come back, and the whole thing's done in 20, 30 minutes. It turned out to drag out quite a while. Let's start with you, Craig.
Yeah, you know, it was pretty dynamic. You know, on the way in, again, I said earlier, we did not have an initial fix on the survivor. We didn't know exactly where he was. So as we drove in, initially, you know, the A-10s that would have been covering us in that rescort role had weather delayed back at the base where they were launching from. So my perception was that we were actually in there alone, single ship to begin with, until the MiG cap got busy. They scrambled some F-15s in our area to chase the MiG out, and one F-15 actually dropped down to about, you know, I don't know, about 2,000 feet or so, and circled around us, you know, waggled the wings there, and got a visual on him. And that was the first time I felt like there was actually somebody in the airspace with us that could actually help us out. Right. Beyond that, it was command and control, you know, chatter from the AWACS. You could hear them talking to fighters or tankers or other assets. And so, we did a lot of searching around, like I mentioned before. And at some point, we simply hit bingo, and we had to return back to our staging base to refuel. So on our egress from the area, working our way back towards the border, luckily, people were ready to get in there if the situation would allow. We had a tanker hanging out right on the border, was running up and down, just in case there was potential to send them in. But we were able to get out with our min fuel and make it back to the base and hit the hot refueling pits. And that's when things began to change. So we spent a full mission, bag of gas, as we like to call it, in the area. We're back out refueling, and that's when the radio chatter picks up, where the A-10s had then gone over us and deep down into the battle space, made radio contact with Devon Jones at that point and began to authenticate him. And when I heard chatter from the AWACS talking about the authentication process over the radio, I got pretty excited. We're refueling. We had a few minutes left in the hot pits. We had another aircraft that just arrived and cocking their bird for alert. So, things were about to change. We're about to get the opportunity to go back in, this time as a two-ship formation with some mutual coverage. It's always good to have your buddies with you. And the A-10s were now in the airspace where they're going to be able to provide some support as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that. Greg, would you like to say, how did the crew communicate? Was there a lot of apprehension? Were there concerns that I know Tom was sitting up in the front seat and has to filter all that information, but as the center seat flight engineer, you're sitting up there, you kind of vet those questions as your job as a flight engineer. Would you explain for the audience, how were concerns communicated? Things weren't going that well. So it wasn't just a cut and dried, cross the border, pick the guy up, run out. A lot of people have that perception. Would you like to provide us with the insight on that?
Well, while we were in the hot pits there, like Craig had mentioned, radio chatter picked up. The A-10s had a position on the Survivor, and this really got me pumped, because now we know where he's at. Previously, we had spent all of our time chasing goose eggs out there, and not really coming up with anything. Now we've got something we can go for. And when you've got something you can go for, man, you get pumped and you're ready to go do it. And so then it's just a matter of getting coordinates down, getting your system set up, and having a general idea and talking with your wingman, what we're going to do and how we're going to proceed up there. And actually, when you talk about this is where we all step up, and it's all because of our training. That we'll take it and run. Don't tell us how to do it. Just tell us what you want the end result to be. We'll figure it out en route.
Well said. Tom, I'm going to push it back to you. Were you forced to improvise, adapt, or innovate during that mission? And so what exactly did you do different that you did not expect to do? I'll start with Tom.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind, but the first one I want to say is kind of back on that last topic, and what Greg was saying is it really comes down to you will end up operating the way you trained. And if you simulate things in training, you won't remember to not simulate them when you get to combat, and that the nerves raise, everybody's anxiety raises, and you start trying to think faster than you really ought to. It goes back to what Craig said about when we started engines that morning, and we compressor stalled number 2 engine on the engine start. Only time it ever happened 20 years of flying 53s that I compressor stalled on a startup. So I immediately start processing all of these bump plans and all things are going. I think it was Greg said, I think we just start number 1 today first. And we shut down number 2, started number 1. Everybody looked at each other, started number 2 again, and it cranked right up and flew for 8 hours that day and flew all day long. And it was that kind of thing that kind of brings everybody back down and just go at the normal speeds, do it the way you've been trained. But to answer your question specifically, we did a few things like when we finally got there, we'd gone 4 hours up in Iraq without any radio communications with Lieutenant Jones. And finally, the A-10 guys get him on the radio. We now know he's alive. At that point, we figured based on the previous few days, he had already gotten rolled up and was probably already captured. That had to be the reason why we couldn't get him on the radios anymore. And then they reestablished radio contact. We started pushing up there, but we got to figure out some way to communicate with an A-10 when we have no secure comms. We're all operating and we don't have anybody vectoring us. The AWACS are so far away. We're 600 miles away from the nearest Allied forces at that point. Wow. And I got to figure out a way to get the coordinate that he's got on his old inertial navigation system that hasn't been updated in about 6 hours. We know it's somewhere in the ballpark. He's operating so far north that he's off the charts that he had. He actually didn't have a map of the area that he was working on when he moves up to find the survivor. And we basically had to take out of the ATO, we took the number of the day. I said, took the last 4 coordinates or the last 4 digits of each coordinate, the north and the easting, and said, use the number of the day, add that number to it and pass that to me. And then we're sitting there and Greg and Jim and Mike and I are trying to uncode that number with a code system that we just made up. And we don't really have time to think about how easy it is if somebody's listening to us, because we know the Iraqis are now listening to us on a basic rescue frequency that is not secured, that the whole world can listen to. Right. And so we made up a coding system so that he could pass us a coordinate.
That's really interesting, and that sort of dovetails into what I want to talk about. Okay, you guys have been out there a while. The Iraqis finally found you. Okay, and they were on to you at that point. The ground forces, there were helicopters, other helicopters out there. Things started getting a little exciting just prior to the pickup. Craig, I'm going to go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, so we're 2-ship. We're back in towards the general area where the survivors are located, and at least we had the A-10s overhead at that time, so it was pretty comforting to have those guys kind of leading us in, giving us a vector, and marking the location for us. I believe the call was by the lead A-10. I'm going to overfly the survivor, and I'm going to go vertical and aim for that direction, right? He's going to be right about there. So Tim Hadrich up on the left gun was, scanning, had kind of that activity on his side of the aircraft and could see that play out. We had left our sister ship, behind about a mile or two. I can't remember exactly how far, but I believe the discussion was, we're going to go in for the pickup. You guys hang here, and then if we ball it up, you can come get all of us. But the challenge in the desert was always ever the dust out landing. That's something we spent a lot of time gaining some proficiency in, and usually most crews got proficient at doing that at night, but it had to be a very well set up approach, hover symbology, all that good stuff, to make sure that you could stick those dust out landings the first time. So when you're coming in kind of hot and a lot of actions happening all at once, you kind of, what's going through my mind is, we're just going to go screaming in there. We're probably not going to have a chance to set up that nice, long, comfortable approach, or at least a typical profile. The radio chatter's going. We got a vehicle ingressing the scene, Iraqi truck, and we know, okay, they've DF'd him. They're coming right for him, and some things have to happen here. So like we saw in the video, Mike Homan, co-pilot, tells the A-10, hey, smoke the truck. We go into a right-hand 360. Now, as we break into that turn, all of that activity comes into my azimuth as the tail gunner, right? So I got a nice wide field of view. I'm looking around for the activity to come into my azimuth. I'm pointing my 50 cal. What I actually saw first was the first A-10 nosedive, hit the gun, and actually missed the truck. So at that point, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to get a chance to go hot here. But, you know, we're still maneuvering, right? We have to land, and you know, this is rapidly unfolding. So the second A-10 tells the lead guy to roll out, and then he hits his gun, and he just nails that truck dead on, and just smokes it. It's fire and smoke and just stuff blasting way up into the air. And at that point, you know, I'm hearing the comms up front. You know, there he is, roll out. We have to flare and stop the aircraft before we fly past him. At that point, you know, as the tail gunner, my responsibility is literally the tail of that aircraft. My concern is that thing isn't going to hit the ground and get ripped off, and then we're all going to be sitting in the LZ sideways. So as we flared and we come into the dust, luckily I still had the ground, and I had the tail skid and the tail rotor in front of me. And at that point, I don't know if anyone remembers it, but I yelled, "Roll the nose over," right as we were touching down, because we were about to plow some ground with that tail skid. And I literally thought we were going to rip it off. But luckily, we got the aircraft stopped in time that our survivor was still abeam at about the 2 o'clock position. We didn't fly past him, and we were able to, you know, complete the actions on the objective.
That's an amazing recount, Craig. I appreciate that. Greg, do you got anything to add to that?
Well, you know, when that first A-10 missed, myself, I was wanting to shrink. And so rather than watch, I saw the wingman roll in and hit it, you know, and that was like a big relief for me, because I thought things were really going to get heated up, you know, when the first A-10 missed. And being in that center seat, you know, you're just there for the show, and no way to react or nothing you can do except your position's duties right then and there. And that, you know, was airspeed and altitude, get it on the ground so we can get in here, get this guy and get on out. And yeah, when you have that happen, and that's the most vivid memory out of the whole thing for me was watching that first A-10 missing and thinking, uh-oh, this isn't good. So, but the wingman, as soon as he broke off, his wingman was on him, and like Craig said, that truck was just hopping along, just taking all those impacts from that 30 mil, and it was awesome to see that. And now good to get on the ground and get that pilot, you know, and then that's a matter of getting up and getting out of there and getting back, and that becomes another story.
Right. You know, that whole scenario turns into something that it can quickly turn into a horror story. One of you get knocked down, now you've got everyone scrambling to figure out how to rescue the rescue force. Luckily, that didn't occur. Tom, I'm going to start with you. What emotions did you experience after the rescue when you got him, you're flying him away? And what was your emotions? You knew you were missing one. You didn't have the whole crew. You still had Lieutenant Slade, the Rio, that was missing and couldn't be recovered, and the mission was terminated. What was your feelings of it? Did you want to keep going? This is for Tom first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were obviously, once we got in the air and got headed south, you know, one of the things that Craig had mentioned earlier, our wingman had actually stayed south a ways, south of the major highway that was back there. And when we finally got him on board and turned south, the A-10 guys asked us, "How'd you guys get across the highway?" And we told them, well, we just kind of pretended like we belonged there and just kind of climbed up a little bit and cruised across. And because he was surprised that road was supposed to be kind of a barrier. We really weren't supposed to be operating that far north that day in the middle of daytime. Our wingman, Mike Kingsley, and his guys were supposed to have waited because that was what we thought was the biggest threat. As soon as we picked up and headed south, here comes the other Pavlo almost nose to nose with us. And I asked him later, I said, you were supposed to wait south of the road. How come? He goes, when we heard all that mess going on the radio, there was no way we could wait. And so they immediately plugged across the road and showed up just about the time that we were taking off and heading south. But we still had probably an hour and a half, 40 minutes just to get back to the border. So we had a lot of work to do. Obviously, Devon Jones is in the back. The first thing he does is ask the guys in the back there and ask us what we knew about his Rio and whether or not anybody had heard from him. And nobody had heard a radio call from him since about 8 in the morning. And it was about 2 in the afternoon, something like this, by the time we had finally made the pickup. So we'd been on the mission about 6 hours. Nobody had heard from him. At the same time, we were thrilled that we finally got one guy on the radio. His Rio was not the first guy that we had not been able to rescue. They were getting picked up really quickly. There probably had been 16, 18 guys shot down by that point in the war, just in the 4th day. And we had only had one other attempt, and we hadn't been able to pick up anybody because there was nowhere to hide for them. And it took too long to get there. And by the time we ever could get forces arranged to go, they had already been picked up. So we were thrilled that it was at least an example that we would continue to try, even if it was hard for them to evade. And just that would be a great example for the rest of the combat air forces out there that we had picked him up.
Well, one thing we didn't clarify, you know, your call sign was a moccasin call sign. It was moccasin 05. You weren't the only 53 out there. And I wanted to clarify that for the audience, that you weren't alone and unafraid out there. There's a good graphic. Thank you, Chelsea. That's the actual crew of Moccasin 05. I believe you had Mike Kingsley's crew out there as well. And his crew was standing by, just anxious to get into the fight with you, just as much. And I know as a high bird, it's very difficult for the pickup bird and to just sort of feel helpless. But you have a role. Craig, could you help explain to the audience the whole, you know, we just don't go in as a single ship. Could you explain to the audience what the other role was for the high bird?
Well, you know, I think typically the high bird can offer some degree of, you know, mutual support in the sense of fire support. You know, you're not as, you know, involved in, you know, trying to break contact with any potential targets on the ground or things like that. Actions on the objective, what we call, you know, IP inbound, are really about performing the maneuver in the terminal area, whether that's air to land or some form of alternate insertion extraction, you know, hoist work or a ladder or a fast rope. And in that case, you're involved with the actions right over the objective. So the high bird, mutual support, security, you know, anybody else trying to break into the area, they can defend. They can break contact with the ground. They can provide command and control or comm relay or anything of that nature. And of course, you know, SAR within the same type of aircraft is always likely the need. You know, when you have a large aircraft with a large crew, if that goes down, probably the only thing that's going to come rescue you is another like kind aircraft. So to have that attached in the general area is always an added layer of security and comfort and mutual support.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Greg, you know, after this was over, you rescued, you were back at RR, you recovered, you got him whisked off. What changed for you personally after this mission? Did it change you? Because this is probably the biggest mission of your life ever. And you know, as any Pavlo worth their medal, they're always want the mission, and you know, that helps define them. How did this personally affect you?
Well, I'll start by saying I had a year in air rescue, a 1 year break from the 20th there, where I went over to Korea to the 38th, and I had 58 or 9 saves, you know, in 1 year over there, and I had one, you know, that was particularly noteworthy, and I won't go into that here, but I'll just say this was just another rung higher in the ladder for me. But you know, it's still what I trained to do. So
Right.
I'm paid to do that, and I don't know that I feel anything really any different or it changed me in any way. You know, a lot of it's, you know, we did the air show route for a while. You know, when I got back, you know, I went to some air shows, told some stories, and that's all nice. But the bottom line is, you know, that's my job. That's what I was getting paid for. And there's some missions, you know, this one being combat, like I said, that's just another rung up the ladder higher than what I had done when I was in air rescue. And so, yeah, I don't think it made any big changes in me, you know. It keeps you fired up though, you know.
Right.
You want to keep going and get that next big mission.
Absolutely. Craig, what about you?
Yeah, I'd say that, you know, I was at a decision point in my career where I didn't really know if I was going to stay in. You know, I was toying with the idea of getting out, going to school, doing some other things. And then we had a few folks even transition over to the Army, become warrant officers, and maybe go fly and take that track. So coming off that rescue and kind of how things unfolded after that, it really solidified my desire to stay in Pueblo and to do more with the opportunity in Pueblo and make a career of it. So, you know, I got promoted shortly thereafter, which would assure me some longevity without hitting a higher tenure to be able to retrain and do some other things. So within a year, I was offered the opportunity to cross-train to be a flight engineer.
Right.
So moving from you know, the back of the helicopter all the way up to the cockpit, getting up front and being able to make things happen, you know, to be like Greg, was a start, right? As things would subsequently unfold, you know, I think you know, people had confidence in at least my ability to be a better leader, you know, integrated on a crew. You know, you get more responsibility, you get more opportunities to be, you know, that lead NCO on a crew and take them out, you know, for training evolutions or whatever may come. It's like, hey, you know, get Doc to take those guys out. So, you know, opportunities like that would evolve, and you know, and I guess that's all I want to say about that.
No, and I totally can appreciate that. And you indeed did cross-train to a little bit more challenging position for the audience. Flight engineers are gunners too, but that's why there's two. It's a little bit of combat redundancy. Hey, one goes down, the other one moves up until there's no more left. That was the whole concept. You can take that all the way back from the B-17 days when gunners and engineers were all gunners. But anyway, Tom, what lessons did you learn? I mean, did this rescue affect your whole ability? Did it change your life and how you trained other pilots or new special operators and how you led others? Was this a defining moment for you? And I'll extend this to General Trask.
Yeah, I think at the beginning, in particular, like Greg said, at that moment, we didn't understand that this mission would really be unique. We thought it was just breaking the seal, that it was going to be the first of many missions and more rescues. There were 2 other combat rescues that happened during the Gulf War. One was done by the Army, picking up an Air Force pilot. One was done by the Navy, picked one up in the Persian Gulf. But that was pretty small number. But what changed really in the matter of days afterwards is that the Iraqi IADs continued to be degraded and come down, and our missions all focused back to normal special operations missions. We spent most of the rest of Desert Storm flying Pinzgauers and doing very heavyweight special operations work, really thinking about new ways to function our weapon system at weights that we had never planned to do. And that became something that stuck with us in Pavelo for the next 20 years of the life of the weapon system, as we came back and we did a max gross weight increase of 8,000 pounds up to 50,000. And all that was based on what came after the rescue. I think it was after the war before we realized the impact that the rescue mission had. And then all of a sudden we found out we were being put in for these high level medals for that mission. And really we'd gone on and done all these other things. And not that we'd forgot about it, it was still a very cool thing that we'd done, but it kind of got a life of its own later on after the war. And so what I learned, what affected me is I became a spokesman, and not just for the crew and for our squadron, but for special operations in general, because I ended up traveling with the SOCOM commander for a while, telling my little war story and representing Air Force Special Operations. I would go out to the Marine Corps Tactical School where they would study how to do what the Marines call TRAP, which is Tactical Recovery, Air Crew and Personnel. And so we would compare notes on how we did rescue and the lessons that we had learned. And so for me, it meant I had to think broader than just being a crew commander, which is all I was focused on at that point in my career, that it was important to go out and think about how we integrated with the rest of the Joint Force and with the big Air Force.
Well, and you were awarded the Silver Star. And Craig and Greg were awarded Distinguished Flying Crosses. I'd say this was a significant impacted mission, even though you did other things. And the Air Force thought so too. We weren't so popular with the Air Force back in the what I used to call the wonder years in the 80s during the Tactical Airlift Command. We were an afterthought, underfunded, underpaid, and overlooked, I always used to say. But now, all of a sudden, you guys are awarded for the best meritorious flight of the year by the Air Force. The award it's called the McKay Trophy for the audience. Chelsea just put up the graphic. That it was an amazing and defining moment for you all. Craig, how did that impact you? Did it matter, or you just went on being Craig?
Yeah, I think you know me already. Better than that. Yeah, I kind of went on being Craig. I had a lot of runway ahead of me and what I was going to end up doing as a Pavelo guy. I was pretty young back then. I'd only been in the squadron 2 years, and I would again cross-train, become a flight engineer, and then move all the way through to a 20-year end in my career, where my focus was to remain in the weapon system, to take advantage of all the things that changed after Desert Storm, the technology insertions, the capabilities that we later gained to geolocate survivors, to IDAS MAT and those kinds of modifications to the aircraft, to change and improve our TTPs. All of that just became my focus. We sought other venues to try to, sharpen the spear, so to speak. We spent some time with the Marines in WTI. We later got into the weapons school with the Air Force, and I went hard over on a tactics focus for really the rest of my career. I did a lot of other things, after that rescue, in theater and beyond. The Balkans were a thing, Africa, different places. And, if anything, it just kind of set in a lot of other people's minds that if you want to end up doing some really cool stuff, you need to have Craig Dock on your crew.
All right, Greg, I'll finish that thought with you. Go ahead.
Well, it's just a great honor, to be submitted for something like that. I'm like Craig. I started out as a gunner, and I became a flight engineer because there were people who were mentoring me who believed my capabilities and my ability, to go ahead and excel and move further up the chain. And while I didn't move to the top of the chain in terms of ranks, certainly I moved to the top of the chain in terms of abilities and her capabilities. And it's nice to have the recognition, and I've just been blessed, in a lot of ways throughout my Air Force career, with opportunities and being at the right place at the right time and never giving up. You get the mission done and get the aircraft home.
That's well said. Chelsea, that I know there's got to be some audience out there that really have some questions for the panel. Go ahead and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, yeah, we have quite a few questions and we're running low on time, so we'll try to do some quick fire answers here.
Right.
The first one comes from our friend Dirk in Belgium. He said he wants to know which weapons and equipment were carried for survival and evasion purposes by the MH53 crew. Was there any specific equipment for that?
Craig, I'll turn that over to you if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, we had pretty limited quality of self-protection and survival gear. We had the old school survival vest with a PRC 90 radio, a couple of signaling flares, that sort of thing, maybe a strobe light. And one of the things that we had to adjust, or at least I did, being in the back of the helicopter, was we didn't traditionally fly with body armor. So we had Vietnam era, what we called chicken plate, very heavy, bulky body armor. So I pretty much had to dismantle the typical survival vest that I would fly with and figure out ways to take only the essential pieces of aircrew life support equipment that I felt I needed. And then I would shed the rest that was superfluous and maybe gear up with more ammo. Self-protection, obviously 9mm Beretta, some version of what was an M16 platform, but modified. I had a shotgun, grenade launcher, those kinds of things. But really for the, for survival and to affect our own pickup, the key things are definitely a radio and extra batteries, a strobe light. And believe it or not, that chem light on a piece of 550 cord, when you spin that thing around, that became very recognizable at long distances, either on MBGs, whether it be IR or an overt chem light. And so just having that kind of stuff on hand was about the best we could do at the time. Technology would port in and give us better options, 10 years down the road. But that's pretty much what we had then.
Well, I appreciate that. Greg, what about you? Real quick. Okay, well, Greg didn't do that. Let's go ahead and ask the other question.
All right, so this comes from Johnny. He wants to know if you can expand on the lessons learned from this rescue changing things. For example, did TTPs get changed? How did long-term policy or deployment priorities change? Anything like that?
Yeah, I can jump in with that. A lot of, the rescue community was standing back up. We were building an MH-64, so they studied the mission a lot. And they studied a lot of the successes and failures of CSAR in general in the Gulf War, and because the record was very poor across the Gulf War. But there were some unique reasons operating in the desert. And the biggest one was you can't take all these Vietnam lessons learned that we're fighting in the jungle, apply them to a desert environment, and primarily in the evasion piece of it. And then in the electronically locating survivors, that was the hardest part. Was the distances were so vast. Those radios only had very short limits on them as far as how far they would work, and it was really hard to get communications with survivors after they were shot down. A lot of time was spent to improve that capability going into the Balkans, Allied force, and eventually into Afghanistan and Iraq.
Tom, I'd like to caveat that there were terms that we had never seen or used before. This is also for the audience, where we developed what we call spider routes or different way. A lot of people say point A to point B, let's go rescue them. And no, we had routes that we studied. We looked at threats and we planned accordingly. So a lot of the audience didn't, and that same use of tactic and mission planning carried over into Allied force. And I would like to add that. Chelsea, I think we have time for one more question, and that's all we can.
Rick wants to know if you guys have stayed in touch with or reconnected with the pilot that you rescued.
Any of you?
I think the only time I ever had contact with him was after, well, literally the next day after the rescue, he came over to our hooch where we were living before they flew him out to go out back out to the Red Sea. He was off a carrier in the Red Sea, is where he was based. But about 6 months after the war, we went up to up to Oceana to do deck landing calls. Were you guys on that? And he was still in the squadron up in Virginia Beach, and his squadron hosted all of the 20th guys that were up there doing our DLQs for a week, and had a pretty good beer blast that week over at the squadron at Oceana. But that's the last time I saw him, and that was 1991.
Yeah, absolutely. That's when I saw him again, as well as at Oceana. We traded some patches and coins, and had a good chat, a good recap on how things went down. Oddly enough, about 5 or 6 years later, I was in England and I ran into one of the A-10 pilots that was overhead during the actions on the objective there. So it was kind of cool to catch up with just somebody else involved in the whole event and kind of recap the story and talk it through. But yeah, would like to see Devon Jones again. Absolutely. And one thing I wanted to mention earlier was that that Rio, Lieutenant Slade, I had a fear back then that he might have been in the truck that got blown up on the scene, and that we probably weren't going to see him again for that reason. So I just want people to know that the fact that a few days later we actually saw him on the news as one of the captured actually gave me a sigh of relief at that point. I knew there was a possibility that we would recover him later, but I was definitely relieved that he wasn't in that truck.
Yeah, I believe he was kept 43 days in captivity. He was tortured, and they had a lot of fun with him, which was terribly unfortunate. We don't want that fate, and that's why we had always carried on the mantra that others may live from our rescue experience and days, that no one's left behind, and we'd put every asset to recover. We carried that all throughout the Pavlo community. I still think the AFSOC and the rest of the U.S. SOCOM forces feel that way today. You don't leave anybody behind, and when you're forced to do that, it becomes a very it just weighs on a lot of people when that happens. Chelsea, I think that's going to bring us to the conclusion of our 5th edition of SOF Stories Live, Operation Desert Storm, the rescue of Slate 46. For the panel, on behalf of the Global SOF Foundation, we'd love to extend a heartfelt thank you for the service to our nation and candidly sharing your firsthand experiences with our viewers. It's been an honor to see you distinguished gentlemen again, and I hope to see you soon. And thank you for participating in today's discussion. Please be sure to join us in February, where our distinguished guest will be the very first commander of MARSOC, and actually assigned to the 20th SOS as a payload pilot, Major General Mark Droopy Clark, U.S. Marine Corps retired. Well, he will explore his recollections of the birth of MARSOC and their actual formal integration to U.S. Special Operations Command. We look forward to having you join us again. Until then, on behalf of the Global SOF Foundation and SOF Stories Live, thank you. I am the host, Chief Master Sergeant Randy Anderson, U.S. Air Force retired and former Air Commando. Good afternoon, and God bless America.
Take care. Thanks.